Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. As some of you will know, I was supposed to release an episode this Sunday about the Scottish devolution movement. After the death of Queen Elizabeth on Thursday though, my guest and I decided it would be best to delay the release of that episode until after the funeral. So here is a replacement episode, released slightly late. Today's subject, the current Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, is a good example of how an affable, anodyne politician can pursue highly divisive and polarising policies. Ardern's premiership, which started in 2017, has been defined by her response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Whilst New Zealand's initial response to the pandemic in 2020 was praised across the world and saw Ardern win a landslide election victory, the 2 years hence have seen New Zealand slowly creep up the death rate table. The Ardern government has also been scolded by voters for a slow vaccine rollout and images of expatriates being unable to come home to visit dying relatives. Partly as a result, Ardern is now the least popular she's ever been, and her party, the Labour Party, is now odds-on to lose the next election in a year's time. Whilst Ardern is clearly less unpleasant than many other subjects on this podcast, this episode is released at a time when she is struggling to reinvent her premiership post-pandemic. Her career is therefore an interesting examination of what happens to politicians when they cease to be overwhelmingly liked. Ardern is still the recipient of uncritical levels of praise in the foreign media, and a healthy democracy is predicated upon us as citizens looking beyond favourable headlines and judging politicians on results, not on our own biases. I should say from the outset that I do not hate Ardern by any means, and nor does my guest today, but many New Zealanders have clearly fallen out of love with her. My guest today is David Farrar, who is a pollster and political commentator. David is the founder of Kiwi Blog, one of the largest political blogs in New Zealand. We discuss Ardern's rise in the Labour Party, her domestic agenda, of course her response to COVID, and what the future holds for her struggling government. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Jacinda Ardern. Hi David, how are you?
Not too bad. Well, as good as you can be with a 5 and a 2-year-old in the house who tend to wake up during the night. So I've only had one coffee so far, which isn't too bad.
Congratulations. David, we're talking about Jacinda Ardern today. She has been Prime Minister of your country, New Zealand, since 2017. I've done episodes before on Canada and Australia, and like both of those countries, New Zealand was a colony of the British Empire, and its political system reflects Britain's in some ways, but it also doesn't reflect it in others. What are the big similarities and differences that you would point to as being most important to understanding how politics works in New Zealand?
The biggest is that we're no longer what you call first past the post. We were that from 1852 to 1993, but they voted in 1993 to go to what's called mixed member proportional. Don't need to know exactly how it works, but the key thing is proportional representation. So it's all really based on the party vote. And perhaps what's unusual is it's designed to produce minority governments because it's very rare for a party to get over 50% of the vote. But in fact, Jacinda Ardern's party in 2020 got 65 out of 120 seats, which has never happened under MMP. It's not meant to happen. It shows how well they did, how popular she was back in 2020.
Ardern was born in 1980. That makes her more or less a millennial, perhaps late Gen X. She's the youngest politician I've discussed on this series, or more accurately, maybe the one that was born most recently. What's her background like?
Her background is sadly probably all too familiar for a lot of politicians today, which is primarily having worked in Parliament as a ministerial advisor. She grew up in a small rural town, and that's been quite a big part of her appeal, is that grew up in it's a little place called Morrinsville. Her father was a policeman. Interestingly, she grew up in the Mormon faith. She is no longer Mormon. She is quite liberal on social issues and went her own way on that. But she grew up in the small provincial town. She famously worked in the Morrinsville fish and chip shop. Which again is sort of part of her story. Her detractors refer to her as, the fish and chip lady, as a way to put her down. Personally, I think that's quite a good thing. And then she went to university, and then she worked for an MP, and then she worked for a minister. And then, and this is when I first got to know of her, she worked for the then Prime Minister, Helen Clark, in the last years of the Clark government. And she then left to go to London, where she worked in public sector jobs there, including, and this is something she doesn't really push on her CV now, but she technically worked for Tony Blair. And of course, now in the left, this is like working for George W. Bush. She didn't work in Downing Street, but she worked for the Cabinet Office, etc. But one of the things the critics will say, I'll come to then her saying for Parliament, is she's never worked in the private sector, except for the fish and chip shop, I guess, when she was at school. She was at university, she worked in Parliament, she went to the UK, did some government jobs there, and then she came back and stood, I'm going off memory here, I think it was at the 2008 election, where she stood for a very safe national seat, a rural seat. She didn't win it, but because we had proportional representation, she came in on the party list. And she stood 2 times in a seat called Auckland Central, which used to be a safe Labour seat, but a very popular National MP, Nikki Kay, held it. And they went up against each other in that seat. Both very popular people, very high profile, both young women. One newspaper called it the Battle of the Babes, which annoyed both of them. But she didn't win that. She was already pretty well known, but her big opportunity came when a former Labour Party leader was appointed to a UN role, and he quit Parliament, and a very safe Labour seat next to the seat she'd stood in came up, and she won that in a massive landslide. I think her majority was 20,000 or so, and she did so well with that by-election, they made her deputy leader because they needed to rejuvenate the party. And then I think it was only 6 months later, around 2 months before the election, Labour were in terrible turmoil, and they were looking for another massive loss. National was looking to get a 4th term, and they panicked, but for them in a good way, and the leader stood down some 2 months before the election, and Jacinda became leader. So it was a quite rapid ascension, 6 months after she became deputy leader.
If I can just come in there and fill in a few gaps. You mentioned Helen Clark. New Zealand is interesting in the sense that Ardern is not your country's first female prime minister. Helen Clark was prime minister between 1999 and 2008.
And there was one before that whom I worked for. They always write her out of those 3 books.
Excuse me, as have I.
Shipley came in through a coup, which you'll know all about in the UK. That's how, well, not a coup, but Theresa May and now Liz Truss came in. Then there was Helen Clark, who was the PM from 1999 to 2008. So Jacinda's our 3rd female prime minister. In fact, male PMs are now the rarity here.
How temperamentally similar are Clark and Ardern? They're from the same party, but obviously they come from different generations. Has Clark and Clark's leadership been a source of inspiration for Ardern, do you think?
No, I'm not sure I would say it has been. Certainly, look, if she worked in her office and she learnt from her things, but the governments have been very different in style and substance and competence. Clark was seen as a quite remote, austere figure. She was very respected, but Jacinda was like massively popular, especially with younger women seen as a great role model there. So she would have learned a lot from working in Clark's office, but you wouldn't look at one, partly because they're quite different ages. Like Helen Clark she came into Parliament in the 80s when we had the Rogernomics Revolution. She fought against that. She was a senior cabinet minister, then she was leader of the opposition for 6 years. Quite different to Ardern, who just came in opposition. Wasn't that noticeable for her achievements in opposition. She was very popular, though, always very good at media, and then became leader sort of quite unexpectedly. While Clark fought her way up, battled off coups, was very tough, I would say.
You mentioned that Ardern was deputy leader in 2017 before she became leader, and she became leader only a couple of months before the general election in 2017. I think Labour, as you said, had not been doing very well in the polls. You mentioned the National Party as well, the centre-right party in New Zealand. They had been in power from 2008 until 17, but they lost. They lost the 2017 election. Why did Labour win the 2017 election? Do you think it was the strength of Ardern's campaign, or do you think it was sort of poor government and a sense of tiredness with the Nats?
There were three factors. The first is National had been in 9 years, and there were issues like the housing crisis, which ironically is far, far worse today, and mental health, which also is probably far worse today. But they were seen as issues where the government was vulnerable. But having said that, National still got 44% of the vote for their what they were seeking for the fourth term. That's incredible. No other party before then had got 44% in any of their elections. Brown National came in on 45, got 47, dropped back to 44. But that was still a very, very good result for a government going into their fourth term. Ardern took them from 23% to 37%. During the campaign, they did take the lead, but they dropped back. She made a couple of blunders. Bill English, the Prime Minister, did a good campaign. And everyone on election night thought National would probably form government again. They were 7 points ahead of Labour. Labour's campaign night was pretty depressed. National's was a celebration. But you have this guy, Winston Peters, in the middle, who had gone with Labour once before, had gone with National once before. But there was a belief that if you've got one party 8% ahead, he'd probably go with the biggest party, especially because he couldn't form a government just with Labour. He would also need the Greens to govern. And he had always campaigned, he hated the Greens. But whether it was better negotiations or a sense of he hated certain National cabinet ministers, Peters then went with Labour. So National did have some weakness, but they still got a quite good result. Ardern absolutely put them in contention. Without her, they would have been in the 20s and National would have been home and hosed. But Peters choosing to go with them was fairly unexpected.
So what was it about her campaign style and her leadership style in 2017 that sort of gave that value added to Labour's campaign then, do you think?
Look, she's incredibly likeable. She comes over with no airs or graces, etc. She was seen as quite aspirational for a lot of people. The previous Labour leaders had all been not that great with the media. She suddenly became leader and did the stand-up press conference for an hour where all the gallery just said, wow, she's great. And I think a lot of people had, on the left especially, had tuned out. They were just quite depressed with the state of the Labour Party. So suddenly they had hope. and she got mobbed on campuses and also released some quite bold policy, most of which they failed to implement, but she had real momentum. It was looking for a while they would actually get more votes than National, but National fought quite a tough campaign back. She made a bit of a blunder on tax policy, saying that they would bring in a capital gains tax, which she then had to backtrack on. Instead, they just said they'd have a working group look at it. But yeah, it was sort of Jacinda mania, I think, is what you would call that. And part of it is just that youth and vitality, but also, I do know her a wee bit. She is a very genuine person. When we talk about how she responded to the Christchurch Mosque massacre, the fact her response was just her being absolutely genuine, not a politician, was part of why she did so well there.
How does she describe her own politics?
Well, here's an interesting thing. She was the president of the International Union of Socialist Youth. So that's all the centre-left to left youth wings around the world. She doesn't use the term socialist, though, but she describes herself as, social democrat.
And in terms of what she set out to do after 2017, how did that social democracy sort of manifest itself in what she, rather than just said on the campaign trail, what she actually did?
She branded herself on 2 or 3 big issues. One was climate change. She said it was her generation's nuclear moment. That's a reference back to when the New Zealand Labour government back in the 80s declared themselves, passed a law, nuclear free, no weapons, no power. And that's become an iconic part of New Zealand nationhood. So she tried to say what that moment was is now climate change. She also said child poverty is the reason she entered politics, to solve or reduce child poverty. So they're 2 very traditional social democratic left issues of climate change and child poverty. She also promised to solve the housing crisis by building 100,000 affordable homes, and also to build a light rail system in Auckland that would be up and going within 4 years. There were other promises, of course, but they were the ones that she was branded on: light rail, climate change, child poverty, and housing.
You, David, I hope you don't mind me describing you as centre-right. Would you say that's right? Okay, so you're a centre-right person who I can't imagine is particularly sympathetic to any of her policy pronouncements on those issues, or at least most of them. With your most sort of objective hat on, though, how do you think she's got on those 4 issues?
Well, funnily enough, I do agree with the objectives in several of them, but almost the evidence, because the evidence is so strong, is near total disaster on some and very lackadaisical on the other. And this is why, it's now very competitive. While in New Zealand, all MMP governments have done 3 terms, they face a very real possibility they're behind in the polls. They'll lose despite the huge majority. The most stunning one is the 100,000 Kiwi build houses. They were promising to build 100,000 in 10 years. After 5 years, they have built around 1,300. In fact, I extrapolated the other day that if they kept up this rate, they will achieve their 100,000 in the year 2313. So we're not talking they're out by 10%, they're out by 20%. They'll take 300 years to do what they said they could do in 10 years. It's a total disaster in terms of what they promised. The Auckland Light Rail, they promised it would be up and going the first stage in 4 years. Not only haven't they achieved that, they're now saying by 2025, they hoped to sign off a business case. So they promised built, ready, passengers on it in 4 years. That's now become 8 years to do a business case. The child poverty, it depends on what stat you use, but some of them have gone down a bit, some have gone up a teeny bit, but there hasn't been a dramatic reduction. And up until the COVID pandemic, greenhouse gas emissions had actually gone up. They'll point to policies that will impact in the future, but the actual record's low there. And they've banned natural gas exploration in New Zealand, and what's happened is we now import coal from Indonesia because we need it for electricity. So there has been, I could give you another half dozen examples, but I think it's their biggest challenge is they promise things and don't deliver. And look, some of these are hard. To build 100,000 houses is hard, but another minor one is they promised the entire government fleet would be emissions-free by 2025. Now, that one's actually quite easy because that's not the public. That's just the government fleet. You just tell your government agencies, only buy electric cars in future unless you get permission. But they've only got 4% of the government fleet electric after 5 years, and they promised 100% there. So they have failed on big, they've failed on small. Yes, I am centre right, but I would have liked them to succeed on the child poverty stuff more. I actually do think the only way forward is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We can disagree on how to do it, but they really have done a very bad job there too.
I think at this point, a certain degree of context needs to be brought in terms of the biggest event of Ardern's premiership, because I think perhaps we can link those policy failures to this. And that's obviously the coronavirus pandemic, which is something that she has become known for, not just within New Zealand, but internationally. What was Ardern's response to the pandemic?
At first, people forget this. It was actually a bit slow at first. One of the things I do is I'm actually a pollster, and we do weekly polling, and they were quite slow to close the borders. And it wasn't until when our weekly poll, they started to drop, that they then said, okay, we have to take action. And then they did take action, and they closed the borders. And then they brought in, similar to many countries, very strong public health measures. In fact, we had I think it was 6 to 8 week total lockdown where everyone had to stay home. Because we were an island nation, it did work in the sense that up until a year or so later, the number of cases we had in New Zealand dropped to, half a dozen a day type stuff. And they were mainly people being held in what we call managed isolation. So you had New Zealand looking at the headlines from especially United States, where their death toll under Trump was racing to 1 million. Our death toll was something like 14. So the election was held during the middle of that in September 2020. And also Ardern, she's always been a very good communicator. And she did a daily press conference. In other countries, they were done by the Minister of Health or by officials, but she almost every day ran the press conference with Director General of Health. And these were watched by probably 20% of the population. And people would stay for an hour waiting and things. So her profile was incredibly high, and people at that stage were we're so much better than the rest of the world. We've had no one die. Look at the UK, look at Sweden, look at America.
As you've said, New Zealand obviously has a pretty low COVID death rate by international standards. Well, yes, this is what I need to come on to. In the fullness of time, obviously, New Zealand, as lots of other countries did, pivoted to what it referred to as a zero COVID strategy. And in many ways, New Zealand was the progenitor of the zero COVID strategy. And this, for all sorts of reasons, is more controversial. if you look at the longer term of New Zealand's COVID strategy, that's to say not just 2020, but 21 and 22 as well, what does the balance sheet look like for you on the COVID response in New Zealand?
Look, overall, if you take the death rate as the most important thing, we are still much better off than most OECD developed countries. And most people, when polled, still think the government's overall response was good. Having said that, our death rate is now higher than Australia's. And Australia, like us, is an island nation. So, we did have a natural advantage, which I don't think any country in landlocked Europe could really do, where you actually could just close the borders, you can't drive across, etc. Where it started to go a bit wrong for the government was we were very slow to get the vaccine in. People accepted the notion of, we'll close the borders, we'll have the restrictions. There were a couple of extra lockdowns when there were leaks at the border, which did start to annoy people. Auckland got locked down several times. So people started to get grumpy then. And the government said, we're going to be first off the cab to get the vaccines. Actually, they mucked around getting the order in. They ignored emails from Pfizer saying, hey, we're keen to meet. And we were almost the slowest rollout to start in the developed world. So you started to get people saying, well, actually, look, it's good we have a low death toll. But, if we had got these vaccines in, then we could be lifting some of these restrictions. So that was the first part where it started to become less popular. And then partly because the vaccine rollout was taking so long, people started to get over the restrictions. People started to get over Jacinda somewhat too. What had been her biggest strength, the 1 p.m. press conferences, people then found that they were starting to become nagging. I don't use that term for it's a sexist term to a degree. You don't talk about men nagging, but in terms of what people were saying, it's interesting. She stopped doing them. And in fact, even when quite major events happened, she was then not on that podium very much at all. So people got oversaturated with her. The vaccine rollout was slow, but not a majority of the country, but a significant minority were, we're over this, we've been vaccinated, we don't want to have to, have all these restrictions on how we travel, etc. And we saw, like you saw in many countries, protests where our parliament ground was occupied for, I think, a couple of months. Now, in the end, the protesters left at the end turned quite violent and nasty, and that probably helped the government because their opponents were seen as terrible people. But actually, in the earlier days of that occupation, my research company got commissioned to survey them on why were they there, who were they, and actually the party that was overrepresented the most and who was there from those in Parliament was the Green Party. Because a lot of anti-vaxxers have tended to be on the left of the spectrum in the past. There was a lot of Māori, Indigenous Māori there too. They sort of saw this as government overreach. So, again, it was a majority, but polls showed you had around 30% of people having some sympathy for the protesters there, thinking, it's gone on too much. And then since then, they have gradually lifted more and more restrictions. This week, they may decide to lift the final restrictions. Other countries have already done that, but we still have mask mandates. We still have a traffic light system. There's certainly people have left the government behind. I've noticed every week fewer people are obeying the government laws, etc. And there's this feeling like the government maybe unfairly gave themselves all these powers and they're a bit loath to give them up. They like the control.
In terms of the lockdowns, I'm not particularly interested in getting into a sort of philosophical discussion about whether lockdowns are a good or bad idea. But I think that what
necessary evil might be there. Yes.
Yes. I think what I'd like to touch on, though, is an idea of an effective lockdown. And I think certainly in the first few months of the pandemic, it became clear that New Zealand had locked down much more effectively than Britain or the United States. Now, again, you can argue that it had more time. I don't think New Zealand got its first COVID case until March the 1st, 2020. Britain, just for comparison, we got ours on January the 31st. There's a 4-week window there. You must at least give Ardern some credit for having locked down effectively, because I think what we've learned is that when lockdowns are effective, fewer people die.
Yeah, look, the first lockdown was necessary, absolutely. We didn't have vaccine. We didn't know how lethal it would be. And also, I think New Zealand was very fortunate that the variants that came later, when we did open up, were much less lethal than the earlier variants too. So with that benefit, perhaps of hindsight, absolutely the first one. But we then had the later lockdowns, which were less popular, but also the government, even once we weren't totally locked down, they still had terrible systems for letting New Zealanders return home. Their first system was where you had to basically spend 12 hours on a computer trying to hit refresh for a room to come up and manage isolation. They didn't do any sort of priority. So we all have friends overseas who couldn't come back, massively unpopular. They then scrapped that for what you call a lotto system, where you randomly allocated numbers to people, and the first 1,000 would get to come home. So people could take months and months trying to get home. And these are people who would still go through managed isolation. We even then had the situation where there was a New Zealand war correspondent, quite famous, Charlotte Bellis. She's the almost only female journalist in Afghanistan, interviews the Taliban, where she got pregnant, and the government wouldn't let her qualify to come home. So she actually had to fly back to Afghanistan to give birth, and she went public with this, and there was a very big backlash. Like, the government had gone so into this mode of we're in control, we're locking down, we're keeping the borders there, that you're locking out pregnant New Zealanders. And in fact, she wasn't the only one. There were numerous pregnant New Zealanders who couldn't get home to give birth. So the lockdown started necessary. They started and they did a good job. But for a lot of the public, not everyone, the government became heartless. They were so worried about, if you're cynical, if we have a more relaxed border and we get more cases, that's going to damage our popularity, and ignoring, I guess, the human toll. There were cases of people with dying relatives who couldn't get back in time to be with their ones, or if they were allowed back, they were told by the government, you can visit your dying father for half an hour and then you have to go back to your hotel, etc. And, the risk profile from these people was minuscule compared to the impact on them. So Ardern's popularity during that sort of late 2021, early 2022, took quite a hit during that period.
Yes. And this is what I want to get into now, really, because
when you get to brand 2 of being kind, her brand, and she said, I believe you can be kind in politics, you cannot lie in politics. So her brand was kindness, but her government wasn't being seen as kind.
You mentioned that she won this unbelievable landslide in September, I think it was 2020, 6 months after the start of the pandemic, when it appeared that in sort of, provable terms, demonstrable terms, New Zealand had done quite well. If we fast forward to now, Ardern is now the least popular she's ever been as Prime Minister. Is this COVID weariness, or is it more mixed? Is it, inflation? Is it just midterm blues? What do you think is causing this?
I don't think it's midterm blues too much, because if you look at the previous long-term Prime Minister, John Key, he was still halfway through his second term very popular. Ardern's popularity had reached stratospheric levels. One of the questions we ask is like favourable, unfavourable, and the net favourability for her was up at plus 60 to plus 70 for a while, especially after the Christchurch Mosque massacre, where she handled that incredibly well with empathy, masterclass in both empathy and a policy response. At the height of COVID, she was at around plus 50. She is now at around plus 9. Now, to be fair, a lot of politicians and prime ministers would love to be at even plus 9. Boris, I think, left office on around minus 30. Jeremy Corbyn was sometimes minus 50. Too early to see where Liz Truss is. But, Scott Morrison was around minus 20. Biden, minus 15. So plus 9 is still positive. So I don't want people to think she is now so unpopular she's definitely going to lose.
But it's the fall,
in a short
right?
period of time, she's gone from plus 50 to plus 9.
Yes, and it's always quite interesting to view politicians that were once very popular getting less popular. You mentioned Blair earlier. He'd be a good example of that.
Jacinda didn't invade another country.
No, quite, yes. I mean, but in terms of her vision post-COVID, her popularity was very much based on the fact that she had handled the pandemic so well early on. I mean, it's worth remembering she didn't even actually win the first election, as you said. She lost the popular vote in 2017. She then got this big burst of popularity because of the pandemic, which I think is probably fair enough. How has she adapted her style and her government to dealing with being much less popular?
Well, they're doing more policy U-turns. They're worried they're now behind in the polls. An example is they had a little tax bill that they introduced to Parliament, and one of their little things in there was that they now apply GST on retirement fund management fees. They thought this was so insignificant they didn't even mention it in the press release. Then someone pointed out that the modelling showed there'd be $100 billion less money in people's retirement accounts by 2070. They reverse course literally the next day. U-turns happen in politics. You don't normally see them in 24 hours. So they are being more poll-driven. They're doing daily polling. They have this credibility problem on being able to deliver big projects. So they are looking more at getting money into people's hands. When the cost of living crisis struck, they basically said, we'll just give every person under a certain income $450, which isn't the best way to target things. And then as it turned out, that 800,000 less people got it than they said would, but people who had lived overseas for 10 years and in fact dead people got it too. So once again, you have this thing where they respond quickly, they're in a panic with the polls, and they're not doing that well on the delivery front. Having said that, Ardern is still aspirational to a lot of younger women especially. One thing we haven't mentioned is, I think the day before, the day after they found out that I think it was a few days after Winston decided to put them into government, she found out she was pregnant. So there was a lot of excitement when she announced that, because knowing, having had two young kids myself and seen the role it takes, well, on all parents, but especially on the mothers, to have a young woman say, I've just become Prime Minister and I'm also going to have a baby. And, she took a few weeks off work and people loved that, she'd sometimes have the baby and at work with her. A lot of people still see her as very aspirational and inspirational. But on the cost of living crisis, female voters have been her biggest support base by far. Men soured on her first. But cost of living, twice as many women say it's the biggest issue as men, and they have started to leave Labour too, because they're the ones who often do the household shopping, etc. And, basically they're struggling to pay the bills.
You mentioned various issues that she came in with in 2017: housing, child poverty, climate change, the light rail in Auckland. We have this debate constantly now about Boris Johnson that had the pandemic not happened, he would have been much more successful in implementing various elements of his manifesto. And then the pandemic sort of washed all over him and he was completely rudderless thereafter. Do you have any sympathy with Labour and Ardern in the sense that perhaps had the pandemic not happened, they might have been a bit more successful in getting some of that stuff done?
A bit more, but the reality is that before the pandemic, because they had 2.5 years there, they were already so off course on Kiwi build that they'd already abandoned their target. They said, we're dropping the target. The light rail had already effectively stalled and halted, and it was clear they wouldn't achieve it well before COVID. Some of the stuff around health, you certainly can say, COVID's put strain on the health system, etc. So they've now got horror health stories, and part of that is probably because of COVID. But no, their inability to deliver does predate COVID. COVID wouldn't have helped. But, the previous government, rather they weren't on the same scale, had 2 massive earthquakes in Christchurch, which were quite significant events they had to deal with too, and a major mine disaster where 26 people were buried and burnt alive, to be blunt, in a terrible mine accident.
This is a podcast about people that are generally disliked and virtually always controversial. And I think Ardern's COVID policy has obviously been very controversial. But something that I think you could definitely criticise her for from what you've said is that she has a tendency to chase polls.
Not unique to prime ministers, that trait.
Certainly not, no. But she clearly she has this.
Yeah.
Was her pandemic response a response to polling?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Again, because I see the weekly polls, I saw them dropping. There were 2 big not festivals. There was a Pacifica festival coming up and the 1-year anniversary of the Christchurch Mosque massacre, which were going to be quite major events. And the government was still planning to go ahead with both of those early on. And it was only when they really dipped in these were the private polls, but I'm sure theirs said the same, that they suddenly, literally at the last moment, then said, no, we're not doing them. And then they brought in the lockdown system. But 48 hours earlier, they had been saying, no, we're going ahead. And they were doing very regular polling throughout. It really annoyed me because everyone was about, we're just following the science. And actually, that wasn't the case all the time. Public opinion was a big part. And the New Zealand public was very scared. They saw the US, they saw the UK. So if anything, there was this public demand for even more zealotry in the lockdown, and even tougher lockdown, because people just wanted to be kept safe. Even when you actually had public health officials sometimes saying, this is going too far, you don't need to do this. People were like, well, it will be popular with the public. Look, polling certainly did play a part of that. But I think in terms of what people have become most hating her for, I will use that word, and John Key was hated too, previous one, is when you look at the polls of favourability, it's not just that people have gone unfavourable, but there are a significant number who are what we call strongly unfavourable, where they really do hate her. And I think there is the lockdown, because wherever she goes now, some of these protesters follow her around. Now, look, a lot of these protesters are in the conspiracy theory camp. They think, it was all a Pfizer plot, the vaccine, etc. Not all of them, but some of them. But at the end of the day, people's rights were taken away from them for 2 years. And I call a necessary evil. The first lockdown, etc., was there. But where the government, I think, was quite bad is they didn't actually show empathy for people who had suffered from these. A big one was the vaccine mandates, where people in certain sectors lost their jobs. They lost their entire way of living because if you're a nurse, you can't suddenly become a labourer. And yes, it was probably the right thing to do to have a vaccine mandate for them. But you've had all these people, tens of thousands, lose their jobs. And the government didn't seem to say, look, we understand you are going through a lot of pain there. It won't be forever. What we're doing is necessary for the public good, and we're sorry it's impacting you. But instead, the governments have demonized them a bit. It's like you're putting the public at risk because you won't get vaccinated. And so for people who've lost their jobs, for people whose businesses closed due to the restrictions, etc., this is very, very real to them. A lot of policies are sort of abstract. If you reform the health system, etc., but losing your job, losing your business, that really impacts families. And for those people, they see Jacinda as the person who did it and actually doesn't care about them.
Well, and for a social democrat, it looks disastrous, right?
Yeah, again, they're not the majority. She's still at +9, but there is certainly a significant minority. When she was at the height of her popularity, if you were at a dinner party and you didn't actually like her, you would not offer an opinion like that because you know that 90% of the people there would jump on you, even National Party voters, and say, oh, no, look, I might not agree with her, but she's great. She's doing a great job. And around 9 months ago, that started to change quite significantly, where more and more people would be saying, oh, no, look, I'm over her, or I can't stand her.
And what about the Nats, the National Party, in all this? How have the National Party sort of come to grips with what was initially a very electorally potent force in Jacinda Ardern, but now doesn't seem that way? As you mentioned, she's sort of neck and neck in the polls, really, with the Nationals now.
The big change was they've stopped the infighting. They had a series of leaders, Bill English, then Simon Bridges, then Todd Muller, who lasted 6 weeks, and then Judith Collins, who was very controversial. But a John Key type figure. John Key had a big business career before he became leader and PM. A guy called Christopher Luxon was CEO of probably New Zealand's most beloved company, Air New Zealand. He probably would have rather waited till he'd been an MP for 3 or 4 years becoming leader, but things fell apart for National. Him coming in where he's actually got background in business, he's seen to be good on the economy, and he's seen that he can deliver things, is quite a contrast to Ardern. He is morally more conservative. He's Christian. He's middle-aged, balding male. So very much a contrast to Ardern, but they are now level necking in the polls in terms of party vote. As I say, normally in New Zealand, we've only got 3-year terms. I'd love us to have a 4 or 5-year term. You normally get that third term. The fact that they won a massive majority in 2020 and they're now neck and neck, slightly behind for getting a third term is very significant. National, though, still has quite a lot of work to do. Luxon's done a lot better than previous leaders, but people still don't quite know what they stand for. And I think it's possibly a bit similar to the UK, where the Conservatives have become unpopular in the UK, but I think there's still doubt over UK Labour and whether Keir Starmer can sort of stand for something where people say, this is what I want, rather than just he's better than the other lot.
The next election is about a year away. Do you have a sense of what's going to happen?
2-3 months ago, I would have said National was 60-40 to win. I now think it's probably back to 50-50. The government is using the levers of office to do popular stuff. They're responding quicker. They're about to lift the COVID restrictions. And National hasn't capitalised as well as it could, I think, on some of the cost of living issues after doing quite well at first. So I actually do think it's probably very much in the toss-up category, and it will probably come down. It's going to be very close. Like whoever wins, I think it's going to be a 2 or 3 seat majority, unless some big event happens. Now, if inflation stays very high, if the economy has a slide next year, even more, I think that will help National. So I think it's slightly more favourable conditions to National, but that the next year is going to be crucial.
And what about Ardern? How long? Assuming, let's say that Labour stay in government after next year, but they have their wings clipped. How long do you think she'll be around for?
I don't think she'd do a full third term. There's actually rumours that go around that she'll leave some way during this term, which I think a bit crazy. I don't think there's any way she would leave before this election. But if she got a third term and it was very close and you're probably not going to get a fourth term, I think she could well hand over. And the interesting thing about Ardern, and she actually talks about she sometimes has imposter syndrome, which a lot of people have, is she actually backed her very good friend and mentor, Grant Robertson, to be leader. He stood twice and failed because the unions backed someone else. But she was always sort of aspiring to be the deputy to Grant. And in the government, Grant is almost the prime minister and Jacinda's the president, where she is very popular figure fronting, or was popular fronting up there. But Grant is involved in every major decision as Minister of Finance, as Deputy Prime Minister. He has control of the Labour Party apparatus. And she would be, I think, very happy to hand over to Grant and give him his dream of being New Zealand's first gay or outwardly gay Prime Minister, if they got a third term. The thing is, the rule in politics is you always have to deny you won't do a full term until you go. But I would think it's much more likely than not that if she got a third term, she would hand over to Grant Robertson at some stage during that third term.
I was about to say the Ardern-Grant relationship sounds a bit like the Blair-Brown partnership in Britain until you said that Ardern is very happy to hand over to Grant.
Also, they're very close friends. I think it's the I don't think Tony and Gordon were there. I mean, they had some differences over COVID. He was a bit less, I think, conservative than her on the response, but no, they're incredibly close and good mates. I'm not sure.
Well, so were Blair and Brown for a while.
Oh, yeah, true. At first they were, weren't they? But yeah, not for long in government though. I think it was more in opposition, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah, it was. Opposition can do funny things to people, especially when it's
maybe like
13 or 14
Boris and
years.
Michael Gove until Michael betrayed him.
Yeah. I think
they were very close.
I just have one more question for you, David. If you look at the English-speaking world more generally, the pandemic and certainly the cost of living crisis, which has come after it, appears to have moved politics, at least electoral politics, leftward. Trump lost power in America. The Liberals, Scott Morrison's Liberals, have just been voted out in Australia. Justin Trudeau has won elections post-COVID in Canada, and the Labour Party is leading in polls in Britain now. Do you think the Anglophone world is moving towards Jacinda Ardern's way of thinking?
I'm not sure that's the case. I think there's more... I think the cost of living stuff is going to make it hard for all incumbents because, when you can't fill up your tank with petrol, when you can't pay for your weekly groceries. You don't care about politicians squabbling about what caused it. You just want it fixed. So I think it's more anti-incumbent. And each country's been a bit different. Sometimes there are clear trends where the right was dominant in the 80s, the left was quite dominant in the 2000s. But Morrison was very clumsy in the UK. Trump was, I'm not a fan. I call him this sociopathic toddler, etc. But he was a very polarizing figure. Trudeau has become, I think the biggest comparison would be Ardern and Trudeau, both very young, charismatic, very popular at first. Both then became much more polarizing and controversial. I think Trudeau is now negative popularity. He's quite corrupt, I have to say, from what I've seen. I don't think you can say that about the Ardern government, but they've had some hideous corruption scandals. But the Canadian Conservatives, I don't think, have been a clear enough alternative. But having said that, their last election, they actually thought they would get a majority. They ended up not gaining ground. That's still a victory of sorts, but not a great victory. And with respect in the UK, and you'll be more of an expert on this, but up until things started to go wrong for Boris, they were still well ahead of the Labour Party under Sammer. In most of the polls, the bookies had them at 70% likely to win, etc. So I think it's the problems that Boris did. He did a great job getting Brexit through, etc., which sort of has resulted there. So I think each of them is for quite different reasons. And I think it is more now anti-establishment rather than clearly going to the left or the right.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that's the case, really, that the Anglophone world is moving in a leftward direction at all. I'm certainly quite sceptical as to whether Labour can win the next election here, but it's a discussion for another day. David, thank you very much. That was great. If people want to read your stuff or look at some of the output that you do in terms of polling, where can they go?
Kiwiblog.co.nz is my blog site, which is one of the biggest red centre-right sites in New Zealand. And my company courier is curia.co.nz, where we do a mixture of private polling, but also we release with our Taxpayers Union monthly political poll, which actually tonight's the last night of data collection for that. So we'll be releasing that next week.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.